On the 1st of February, that is Wednesday, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman will rise to present the union budget for the next financial year. And while we know the technical details of what a budget entails, it is always interesting to figure out how would you judge a union budget. And from one year to another, typically the situation keeps changing, the economy keeps changing, the demands keep changing. And so there is no set way to figure out how to judge a budget. But let me share with you 5 parameters over which any budget should come through. So the first thing to look at is obviously the budget speech. This is essentially the introduction to the budget at a general level. And it is largely the least technical bit of the budget, because the finance minister is addressing the House and the general public. And the idea is to tell the larger story or the larger effort that the government is planning to do. However, in this, the first requirement is that the budget should not be too long. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman already has given the longest speech, actually, of all the budgets in India's history. And often what happens is that if you give too long a speech, it is reflective of one of the two things. Either it means that there is too much tinkering, as we saw, say, in the first budget that late Arun Jaitley gave in the first budget that he presented in 2014-15. There were around 27 schemes which had an allocation of 100 crores each. Now, 100 crores looks like a big number for common people, but in reality, in the larger context of the union budget, which was like 18 lakh crores at that time, 100 crores is hardly anything. So there was a lot of time spent on a lot of schemes which were fairly meager, which had fairly meager allocation, and it suggested that there was no clear idea of what you wanted to push. Often, on the other hand, the other thing that it can reflect is that the government doesn't have a clear idea of what it wants to do. It is just the finance minister speaking because there has to be a show of what all has been done, and there is a very good chance that with this being the last budget of the current government, full budget, there is a chance that the finance minister may spend a lot of time reflecting on what all happened in the past and what all achievements are there. But essentially, that is not the purpose of the budget. The purpose of the budget is to tell people 3 basic things. One, how much money is the government going to raise next financial year? How much borrowings it will have to make? And where will it finally use this money? Which sectors and which areas to propel India's growth and increase employment? The next thing that is important in any budget is the credibility of budget numbers. Now, by credibility, we mean that in any budget, as we've explained in previous videos and pieces, any future budget is made on certain assumptions. And if these assumptions are not credible, then those numbers go for a toss. So one of the central things that any budget must have is the credibility should be there with the numbers. For example, in 2019-20, which was the first year when in the second term of Prime Minister Modi, the budget was presented by, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman in July. And she presented a budget which assumed that the economy will grow at 12% nominally and 8% in real terms. The 4% difference is the inflation that was expected to be. Now, in July 2019, some of you might recall that there was already a very clear sense that the Indian economy was slowing down. It had been slowing down from 2017 onwards. And smack in the middle of 2019, it was amply clear to everybody that 8% is not a realistic target. And it is important to understand that if you presume that the economy will grow at 8%, all your calculations for revenue, for expenditure are following on those lines. So if you get that number wrong, then all the budget calculations will go for a toss. As it happened, that year, Indian economy grew at 3.7%. That's less than half of what the finance minister expected. So you can imagine that the credibility of the budget numbers was all over the place. And people didn't actually have to wait till the end of the year. People knew it in July that these numbers are not credible. And that undermines the credibility of the government's efforts. And that is a very significant way in which one can assume or understand whether a budget is good or not. So when the finance minister gives assumptions for the next financial year on Wednesday, the thing to notice is whether these assumptions are robust. Because again, this year, growth is going to be a massive challenge. Globally, the situation is worse. India is performing better than others in terms of growth rate. But even then, most people expect a real growth rate of around 5 to 6% this year, which means if you add, inflation to it, maybe another 5% of inflation, then 11% nominal growth. Now, if the finance minister expects, 15% nominal growth, then that would be wrong. So that is just giving an understanding. Now, the third way any budget should ideally be looked at is to look at fiscal deficit. As many of you know, fiscal deficit is a term that tends to get repeated a lot around the budget time. And it essentially means that how much money is the government going to borrow from the market to make up for the gap between what it spends and what it gets through different sources of revenue. However, fiscal deficit is not the only metric of deficit. There is another deficit called the revenue deficit, which has long been forgotten now. From 2018 onwards, government gave up on revenue deficit. Now, revenue deficit measures the gap between how much government earns for its day-to-day expenses and how much it spends on its day-to-day expenses. So it's like, the amount day-to-day expenditures typically refer to salaries, pensions, and the FRBM Act, the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, essentially asks, the original mandate of FRBM asked for a twofold mandate. It said that the revenue deficit should be zero and the fiscal deficit should not exceed 3% of GDP. What was the import of this? It basically meant that for your day-to-day expenditure, do not borrow from the market. Borrow, if at all, to a max limit of 3% of GDP, but use that borrowing for capital expenditure. Capital expenditure is the kind of expenditure like when you make roads, when you make bridges. These are productive investments. These are expenditures which boost the overall size of the economy. In fact, 100 rupees spent on capital expenditure returns 250 rupees to the broader economy, and 100 rupees spent on revenue expenditure returns barely 100 rupees to the broader economy. So that's why capital expenditure is prioritized. So the idea with FRBM was that, you should keep the revenue expenditure low or zero, and all your borrowings should essentially go towards, creating productive assets, because that way you will earn more revenues and over time things will be okay. However, 2018 onwards, the government has dropped the revenue deficit anchor. So now it focuses only on fiscal deficit. Now, here is the problem. You can have a fiscal deficit target of 3%. You can have a fiscal deficit of 3%, but you can also totally undermine it by having a revenue deficit of 3%, which means that all your borrowings are towards everyday expenses. You are not borrowing to create new assets, in which case over time you will run into all kinds of financial problems. So when you're looking at the budget, don't just look at fiscal deficit, look at also the revenue deficit. And we carried a chart which showed that revenue deficits have been going up significantly. And that's not a good trend. Then coming to the fourth topic is essentially revenues. Now, budgets are about, what the government will tax and where will it raise its revenues from. One very interesting bit about the budget is that disinvestment targets, if you recall, every year disinvestment targets fluctuate wildly. And the reason why they fluctuate wildly is that, the government calculates all its assumptions on where it will get the money from and then sees the gap and typically, tries to fix a disinvestment target. So sometimes it could be 1,50,000 crores, another year it could be just 50,000 crores. And it's not very clear what determines this. And the achievement of these disinvestment targets is also all over the place. And this is not just about this government. Every government has had this kind of a problem. And it is because often disinvestment targets are sort of back calculated to just fit a sort of equation to fit the numbers. So one thing to look at is that, if the disinvestment targets are unrealistic, it means that when the government falters in achieving them later on next year, say in January, when the thing comes through that it hasn't achieved that, that means that gap is going to add up to your fiscal deficit and other deficits. So that is the problem. So that is one aspect of revenues not being realistic, your revenue targets not being realistic. The other is to look at, everybody would wonder that, the income tax exemption should be given and everything. And a lot of people have argued that people have been suffering high inflation. And so the income tax exemption should go up, because somebody earning 3 lakhs 4 years ago or 3 years ago is actually, similar to somebody earning 4 lakhs today. So the exemption should go up. Now, and the idea is that unless you take away the tax burden, people will not be raising their consumption level and the economy will not grow. But in this regard, oddly enough, the most important thing for the government to do, especially in an economy like India, is to reduce indirect taxes, which is the GST. And as the structure is, GST doesn't any longer come under the government's budget. GST or the indirect taxes now come outside, and they are decided by the GST Council. So the thing to understand is that, while it may be tempting to give relief on direct taxes, for a country like India, the salutary thing would be to hold on to direct taxes or raise them on the richer, but give relief on the indirect taxes. Indirect taxes are taxes which everybody pays, and the poor get hit the most. The last parameter is perhaps the most important one, because it is about where does the government spend its money. Because government spending choices actually show government's priorities for the country. Now, if you look at the budget at a glance data, and it's very easily available for all possible years, you can go to the website indiabudget.gov.in and you can get that data. You'll find that on any particular year, India, suppose if India spends, the union government spends 100 rupees, then only 2 rupees of that goes towards health, and only 2 rupees goes towards education. Whereas, the government spends something like 10 rupees on defense, 12 rupees on subsidies of food, fertilizer, fuel, and close to 22 rupees is spent on paying the interest on past loans. So that shows, there is the gap between what are the massive requirements of this country, which are health and education, and how much we lag on that. We have the largest pool of poor people. We have the largest pool of malnourished children in the world. Our health outcomes are very shoddy, and yet the expenditure of the budget in any particular year is just about 2% or marginally above that. So the other way to look at a budget is to look at what the priorities are and whether we are actually spending in areas which will actually give some kind of a base for us for the future growth. So those are the 5 broad areas on which you could determine any budget. Now, on February 1st, do not miss out on watching the Indian Express experts. We'll be live from the newsroom when the budget finishes, and we'll give you our understanding of what the budget aims to do, what are the hits and misses. So please make sure you log on to the live webcast that day. Thank you.